welcome. This is Ignacio Dairit. I'm with the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and we're here to talk about Brownfields basics, how to transform your community. This is the first of two parts. The second part will be next week, uh, 11 o'clock Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern on October 11. So please join us for that because there's going to be more meat in that one. But for this one, there are, for if you're new to brownfields or if you've been around, we're going to try to clear up some misconceptions because uh, brownfields of grant funds are really available to more people, to a lot more people who think, a lot of people who think they're not eligible for these grants. So we're trying to clear the air, give some history, and talk about the funding that's available this year. So next slide. I'm joined by the no by Noemi Emmerich Ford. I think everyone knows Noemi, and if you don't know Noemi yet, then you're gonna meet her and another powerhouse in California, Miriam. I am so honored to be sharing this webinar with them because we've been partners for a very long time, and it just keeps getting better. So next slide. So again, today's agenda, uh, we'll let you know, especially if you're new to brownfields, why you should be interested. Uh, brownfields grant funds are severely underutilized, and both the EPA, the federal government, and California, as is a number of states, are really trying to spread the word that these brownfields grants are a lot more flexible than people think. We will go to the definition. There's a formal definition and a practical definition. And what are these brownfields grants? What brownfield sites and properties actually do to your community, and how the redevelopment of them will actually improve your community, and how to get started. We'll talk about a couple of approaches and a sneak peek to the funding. And so before I go to the next slide, we have a couple of polls here to inform both Noemi and Miriam, who's in the audience. So Devin, can you please post the poll so folks can answer? How are we doing on responses here?
Let's wait a little longer to get some more responses.
Yes, and Bob, the presentation will be made available after this presentation. We might make a few corrections right after, so we're not making it available at this second. Thanks for asking. All right, can we share the responses now? Actually, I don't see the results. Maybe some, there we are. A lot of newbies, welcome, and a lot of new folks as well. So this is great. We really, we really want more people who are new to the field to learn about this opportunity. And this is actually pretty good timing. And what do you want to learn about? Identifying sites, capacity also, a third of you. We give resources and partners, so almost half, and sources of funding. So great. Thank you so much. So the next slide will, let's see. So why should you be interested? Well, a lot of you basically answered the question. you want to learn how to revitalize previously utilized land. And when we say previously utilized land, it could be agricultural, it could be uh, within the scope of a mine area. It could be urban areas, whether it's suburban or rural or urban. So all of these sites a lot of these sites may be eligible for brownfields grants. And you have plans, whether you have a general plan, affordable housing plan, open space plan, uh, community economic development. You might have a SEDS, a comprehensive economic development strategy, and other plans. And all those plans require some kind of connection to the land, because you can't do these have these programs without having sites. And so you may have vacant or neglected lands in your neighborhoods, which might, which might be matched up to these uses. And if you don't have plans yet, it's a way to conduct community and business outreach. Or if you have plans, you can actually refine those plans and match those sites to those plans. And of course, to find the resources. So I'm going to hand off now to Miriam, who is going to talk about the sneak peek into the funding we're going to have.
Thank you so much, Ignacio. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to have you on board. We've been developing a lot of content to help as many people as possible increase their understanding of brownfields, what they are, where they are, how to find them, and specifically the thing that Noemi and I are most concerned about, like how to use our money. We have the money and we want everyone to use it. But this Brownfield series, the part 1 and part 2, really contributes to our trying to connect communities in need with the money. So we'll be talking more about grants in the next presentation in part 2. But EPA has grants, and I'll have Nomi kind of talk about that a bit more. But DTSC has millions of dollars of funding right now to incentivize cleanups and really to attract investment in some of these disadvantaged areas of California. And now's the time to get started on figuring out what sites you think could possibly use this money and start building your application. So with that, let me turn it over to Noemi to talk a little bit about what's coming up in March, and also then turn over this presentation to her, I think.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. Next slide. So first I want to start with, especially since we have so many people who are new to brownfields, I want to start first with what the definition of brownfield. So the definition of brownfields is real property where redevelopment has been hampered by the idea that there is potentially contamination there, or there is contamination at the site. And so the thing that I want to really hone in on is the first 2 words, which is real property. So we get a lot of questions around brownfields, particularly around waterways. Our funding is specifically for land related issues. So there is no cleanup that's done in waterways. We aren't looking to assess waterways at all with our brownfields funding. Next slide. So now I want to give kind of a historical context of brownfield. So sometimes I'm able to understand where we are. It's nice to be able to go back and reflect where we've come from. So brownfields from the very beginning. So how brownfield started was out of our, basically out of Superfund, out of contamination. So think about when industrialization first started, there was no regulation. EPA wasn't started until 1971. And then you really didn't see environmental laws being developed or enforced until the 1980s. And that's where you had a lot of that. If you look at the second to the last slide, a lot of what was called the Superfund chill, where enforcement and fear of liability or cost associated with these cleanups were huge. You saw downtown areas where you had industrialization, where it went belly up, people started moving out to suburbs where they were continuing with the sprawl. Just a lot of inequities around land or fiscal policies, around planning in communities. And then people are familiar with the 2 sites that really kicked off kind of the understanding or knowledge of brownfields, which was the Love Canal in New York, and then the Cuyahoga River, which was in Ohio. Next slide. And so to give you some of that regulatory context are what we call, because we're federal agencies and we love acronyms, CERCLA, which is really our Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. And that's where Superfund comes out of. The CERCLA, this kind of Comprehensive Environmental Resource Compensation and Liability Act, is synonymous with our Superfund law. So the issue with the Superfund law is that it was retroactive. For those who are familiar with legal terms, it was joint and several liability. If you owned one of these sites, even if you didn't cause the contamination, just being an owner of that site would put you on EPA's list as a potentially responsible party. As EPA was going around trying to get some of these sites cleaned up, we would conduct assessments of a site, and if they scored a certain level on our list, they could become a national priority list. Of course, we were doing this in conjunction with state agencies, but being on a national priorities list meant that you had some of the most contaminated properties within your community. There are also other sites that may not have scored high enough to be on the national priorities list, but was still considered a Superfund site, and contamination existed, which was then hampering redevelopment from happening. Next slide. So wasn't just the CERCLA that also brought about contaminated sites or laws that were put into place, but also think about the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which we also call RCRA, which gave EPA the authority to control hazardous waste, which we lovingly call from cradle to grave. So if you think about it from cradle to grave, when are those sites ever going to get developed? I mean, if you work on a RCRA site in the past, it may have been your entire career. And RCRA really just is a permit-based system that EPA has, which it uses to regulate the generation, transportation, treatment, storage, or other proper disposal of hazardous waste at sites. A lot of these programs are also through EPA are delegated to the state, where the state has authority over this. There's also our TSCA, which is our Toxic Substances Control Act, our Leaking Underground Storage Tanks Act. So all of these are laws underneath which EPA has regulatory authority, or we work in conjunction with our states, which all lead to contaminated properties where we're looking to have redevelopment happen. It's not just that Brownfields is looking for redevelopment, but across all our programs at EPA, we call it a one cleanup program. So we're looking to not only ensure that these sites are regulated, but these sites also, if they are defunct or underutilized or abandoned, that these sites are also moving towards redevelopment. And again, of course, many of you are familiar with laws that we have that are governing lead and asbestos. Next slide. And so how Brownfield started, really the evolution of Brownfield started with the U.S. Conference of Mayors. They really pushed back on EPA, and they were looking for some financial relief to help with these contaminated sites in their property. Again, no one was interested in purchasing these properties, because if they did, because of that joint and several liability, they would be held responsible and be held as a potentially responsible party, and EPA would come after them for some portion of the cleanup at these sites. And a lot of these sites, as I mentioned, were just Superfund sites that didn't qualify for the MPL because they didn't score high enough. So part of what EPA did after hearing from all of these mayors is at the end, towards the late 90s, we started developing what we called pilot programs, where we started giving funding, what we called our first pilot Brownfields assessment grant, which we gave to Cuyahoga County in 1993 to give an example of how EPA money could be used to get some of these properties assessed and then hopefully lead towards cleanup. And so it was really in the 1990s when a lot of these Brownfields incentives started being expanded upon. Next slide. And so the Brownfields boom. So basically what happened was industrial real estate, imagine it existed within urban cores because jobs moved around where these industrial facilities were located. So now you have, as you can see what this picture shows, a derelict, huge property that's just sitting there, but you have a community surrounding this property that, one, no longer has jobs, and then two, has this big eyesore within their communities. And so it really led to a lot of socioeconomic impacts. It led to shifts in where people were living. So developers started moving to the suburbs because people started getting away from these areas. They didn't want to live there. And investments weren't really being made because of the liability issues that were surrounding CERCLA and RCRA issue, which meant that a lot of these urban areas where these properties existed were now just sitting kind of vacant and unused, which of course led to the mayor saying, we need help. We need something to happen within our large urban areas. Next slide. So of course, the federal government took heed, heard what the U.S. Conference of Mayors had proposed to them. And in 2002, right at the end of the 1990s, we started discussing what could be done around brownfields. And then January 11th in 2002 is when the law was signed, which is called, we call it the Brownfields Act, but it's now called what it was originally called was a Small Business Liability Relief and Brownfields Revitalization Act. And so what this did was it provided provisions to limit liability of non-polluters. And so it also within that gave funding to EPA to set up its Brownfields program, which would allow funding for both cleanup and assessments up to $200 million a year and then up to $50 million for states and tribes. Next slide. And so as part of limiting that liability, US EPA adopted the ASTM, all appropriate inquiries, which was really a kind of a due diligence process, if you will, in ensuring to make sure that you weren't considered a responsible party at a site. You had to, before purchasing one of these sites, in order to get your bona fide prospective purchaser defense to liability, you need to conduct an all appropriate inquiry before purchasing a property. There are other defenses to liability that can take into effect that also impact brownfields. One is the innocent landowner, the contiguous property owner, involuntary acquisition, where cities or counties automatically get sites put on their payroll because someone hasn't paid their taxes. That's a defense to liability, as well as eminent domain. So there are other things outside of just AAI that allow for your defense to liability and allow you to purchase a site, moving it towards redevelopment. Next slide. So some of the updated approaches. So the Brownfields law was in, I mentioned it was signed in 2002. Well, of course, with any kind of law, you realize, wait, we can make this better. So in 2018, we did some updates. We reauthorized that Brownfields federal law, and it became the Build Act. And within that Build Act, we provided some additional liability protections, because what we were finding out is the ASTM, all appropriate inquiry standard, wasn't around probably before, I don't know, the early 1990s, that gave some specificity for due diligence. So there were a lot of local authorities who had purchased property before 2002, couldn't show that they had done due diligence, but were not the responsible parties. So the Build Act gave them that additional liability protection. So if you are a unit of government, you purchased a property before 2002, and you did not cause or contribute to the contamination, you are now eligible for our Brownfields funding. And then, of course, I'm sure all of you have heard about the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was signed in 2002, and that just provides additional funding to EPA and also prioritizes the use of funding to make sure that there's equity, and we're spending the funding in places that have historically been underserved. Next slide. And so I think I'll turn this over to Miriam, correct? Yeah, I don't want to jump on your presentation. Sorry.
Well, you had such a good flow. I wouldn't have minded if you did. So can we go back one slide real quick? There was just a couple of points I wanted to emphasize. So the updated approaches and these new laws that created a little bit more higher level of protection for potential buyers and users of these sites were really important, especially in California, where over the years we had seen so much hesitancy in getting involved with some of these urban areas, and even in rural areas with mining, agriculture, and lumber type sites, where investment did not want to take on those risks. So these updated approaches were really important for California in particular. And the other two things, the risk-based cleanups and institutional controls, that also ties in with some limitations on how we're approaching cleanups and investigations. So risk-based approaches, which we do apply into certain circumstances, are looking at complete exposure pathways and are people really coming into contact with the media that's impacted? And so there's a lot of technical jargon that's associated with exactly what that looks like. But that was also something that provided an avenue to get properties to reuse in a safe manner while still understanding and recognizing that broader and deeper environmental cleanups may take a longer timeline. And institutional controls were also something that were an important tool that we began to use more and more, which was allowing a particular property to be reused, for example, to industrial standards, where there was a different kind of exposure, more limited kind of exposure, and saying that that site would only be used for those purposes until more cleanup was necessary if the land use needed to be changed. So those were just two things I wanted to point out on that slide. Next slide, please. So what do brownfields mean to a particular community? As Noemi mentioned before, brownfields, the presence of these underutilized pieces of land can mean increased illegal activity for a particular community where they lie. It discourages investment, and some of the broader impacts are that it reduces employment opportunities, it diminishes the quality of life, and the idea of the broken windows theory is that, you know, when a site has a certain kind of aesthetic, it actually, you know, kind of perpetuates, versus the other way of looking at things, that when you have investment in brownfields and people see a piece of land that looks like something to what we have on the screen, when those pieces of land get revitalized, then it actually has the opposite effect, where it attracts more investment and a greater level of interest, and a greater level, I think, of hope comes along with reusing these properties. Next slide. There are, you know, very deep human impacts when it comes to brownfields and the intersection of brownfields and race. And this could be its own separate, you know, several hour long webinar. But basically, because of the intersectionality of sort of decisions made around reuse, historical redlining, and a lot of moving parts and variables, we do see a greater level and a greater number of brownfields in communities of color and underserved communities. And oftentimes, these areas are the ones that also have a higher, you know, higher lift when it comes to pollution, whether it is, you know, air that's impacted because of traffic and proximity to manufacturing or other reasons. So that is something that we are learning more and more and trying to understand better how to offset. There is a federal initiative, EJ40, and you can click on the link when you get these slides if you want to learn more about what's being done to address these intersectionalities of vulnerable demographies, racism, and trying to really look at how environmental justice can be addressed through improvement and alleviation of the brownfield burden that a lot of these communities carry. Next slide, please. So from a practical perspective, this is something that Ignacio alluded to in the beginning when he was making his introductory remarks. Noemi talked about the definition that brownfields are sites where reuse is made difficult because of known contamination or perceived contamination. From a practical standpoint, it is a property where incentives can be used to encourage investment and attract reuses that are responsive to vulnerable communities, environmental justice, and climate change. And so the key thought being that when these communities and when these brownfields are turned around, it can actually really serve to improve the quality of life for everyone who are associated with those properties. Next slide, please. So why, it goes to answering the question, why are brownfields important to a community member, to a city, to a county? Well, because it removes hazards. A lot of these aesthetics that we talked about, these eyesore properties, it actually removes those. And from a community level, it alleviates fears and worries. I mean, so many people live around these sites that have been like abandoned for decades, and they're looking at trash piles and other activities that are so negatively impactful for a community. And turning these properties around really has an impact on the overall health of the community from an anxiety perspective. And there are so many land uses that can be brought into a community when these pieces of land are cleaned up. Housing, open space, jobs through commercial and retail buildings, a lot of employment options, schools, healthcare, and urban agriculture is a big thing. It's also a really good transitional use where you can take a piece of land that's maybe on its way to becoming something else and use it for a community garden, for example, which is such a great magnet for positive uses for a site. Next slide, please. Economic benefits are also a great and very tangible impact when these brownfield properties get resolved. It leverages private investment. We've already talked about how it creates jobs, it increases tax revenue, and really diversifies the economy. We've got some stats here that from EPA that about $20 is leveraged for each federal dollar brownfield federal dollar that's invested. And 9 jobs are leveraged for every $100,000 of federal brownfield funds that are brought within a community. And so once again, it goes back to these questions that we ask fundamentally, why should you care about brownfields and why brownfields important? Brownfields are important because they were created, they're in existence, they're there, we see them. And by doing something with them, we can really revive our communities and bring so much benefit. Next slide, please. And so I'm turning this slide back to Ignacio, but I did want to restate that we understand how difficult it is to get started. People often ask me, is there a list of brownfields? You give me a list of brownfields and I'll start working on them. And unfortunately, we don't have such a list because the definition of brownfields is so broad, and environmental impacted sites, they look so different from each other that there isn't one list to go to. But one of the things we will talk about in part 2 of this is some ways that you can understand what brownfields exist in your community, and you could potentially use those as starting points. So with that, Ignacio is going to jump in and talk about the challenges.
Thank you, Miriam. And just looking at the last couple of pictures, you saw a nice, neighborhood center. Now, and here you're looking at a big building. And when you look at a building like that, you're looking at, well, what happened here? Were there was there contamination released? What's in the building? What happened in the building? And so you start thinking about, okay, it's probably going to be a liability for anyone to take over this site, and even for the current owner. The expense, there's so many steps in removing the liability on the site, doing some research, studying the regulations, and if you need to clean it up, and not just the cleanup, do you want to renovate this building? Does the building need to be demolished? And who will be involved in all these discussions? Some people might think, that's a pretty cool building. Maybe we can rehab it. Or maybe it's actually more than 50 years old and it can be a historic building, or at least want to preserve a part of it. And so all of these cost money. And also, if I were a developer looking at this building, thinking about this, developers don't really have much money to do research. They kind of like, they'll do some advanced studies, but the more communities prepare sites for them, the more likely they are to be attracted to kick the tires and probably study about reusing it, purchasing it. And so that's how you attract prospective purchasers and developers, because a site that has languished for many years will stay in that state unless the community and the local government start doing something about it. And so that's what the Brownfields grants help with. It takes a long time, but if you don't start, you're never going to get to a reuse. Next slide. So, and we talked about the social implications a bit, and just for on the development real estate standpoint, you may have heard the quote that brownfields are just a real estate problem with environmental issues. Well, as we've learned for the last few years, it's a lot more than that. But just on a financial sense, does a site that you're looking at, a brownfield, what's the market value? And does the cost to even purchase it exceed its current land value? You might hear the term upside down site, where the cost of cleaning it up is actually more than the market value. And you also have current property owners, and some of them may be absentee owners who think, who have an inflated impression of what the value of that property is, uh, are still own that site and will not accept any offers that meet their expectations. So that's one issue. Uh, so those are the kinds of sites that really need a lot of brownfields investment and really attention from the local government. Now, when this value of cleaning it up and a cleanup is pretty close to the cost of the property value, those are also uh, sites where brownfields can be helpful. And so those are a couple of scenarios that you're looking at. Uh, Many market developments, transactions that do not have these issues happen without any assistance. But those properties that have that environmental liability, the potential for that, and or have known concerns, will need some kind of assistance. And sometimes even the local government might have to step in and take a larger role the more severe the environmental problem is. And layer that with planning, uh, working with the community on the reuse that is appropriate to the community, as well as any impacts from the new development that have to be probably mitigated. It just gets more complicated. And again, that's where brownfields grants help. Next slide. So, what outcomes land reuse outcomes do we look for? Well, it's to implement your community plans. I mentioned affordable housing, parks, trails, economic development, solar fields, uh, restoration. These are all plans. You might have them in your thoughts, but they're better if they're on paper and already have gone through discussion and approved by the local the local authorities, whether it's a city council or a tribal council or a regional commission. Those plans matter because brownfields is not just about assessing and cleaning up; it's about the reuse. If a site is not a significant environmental threat and can lay fallow, no, EPA is not going to go after that. DTSC is not going to go after that. But the community will be affected, and all those negative impacts that were mentioned earlier in this program. So, and your community plans are the road to getting those sites activated. Uh, and as a process of that, you can safely reuse these brownfields because uh, you don't know what's in there until you start assessing and sampling these sites and what the reuse will be. And again, these are things that you can do with a brownfields grant, involving all the stakeholders. And the brownfields grants now provide some assistance to involve community members, grassroots organizations, and also to balance equity, environmental, and economic goals. It used to be where financial and economic considerations were, not that they were ignoring the social implications, but that was the main challenge early during the brownfields movement in the in the 90s. That's really where a lot of the efforts were going. EPA and DPSC, they were all also uh, familiar, aware of the social impact, but it's only last 10, 15 years where we've all figured out how these can be put together and how the brownfields grants can help solve all these resolve all these goals together. Next slide. So again, it's a reuse focus. Uh, think about your plans, what you want to do, absent any sites. It's just what you need to do for your community to make it better. And you can also work with land trusts and other local government nonprofit organizations, figure out to supplement your community plans, because not all ideas make it into these plans. Some of these plans are old and dated and have to be refreshed and need to be injected with new ideas and what's going on in the community. And if you don't have any of these goals, right now, the Brownfields grants can help you establish those. And then you can find sites to implement these programs and projects. Next slide. So the site focus process pathway is actually where brownfields really started, because it really started with brownfields, Superfund sites, and brownfields being a victim of Superfund sites because no one would take brownfields because they thought they would get stuck with all the liability. So EPA and the states have figured out, okay, this is the way to ease that burden with liability relief. And so the site focus is for the communities, with the local government and the communities to identify the sites of concern. Now, the local government knows this, whether it's a police department, public works, code enforcement, or even the tax folks. They know the sites that need improvement or where illegal activity might be happening. So there, for them, that could be the target sites. For the community, they see it. They may see it through a different lens. That site in their neighborhood could be something else. It could be a community market. It could be an urban garden. In addition to the concerns that the local government may have. And so once you have, get people together, you have your sites, and then you have your projects. You can figure out, well, how to approach your process, your program. uh, Identify sites with the most economic potential, or those that might benefit the public health by reducing exposure to certain chemicals which may be on sites, or actually bring benefits through the reuse on those sites. You can make your neighborhoods more beautiful and increase pride in your community. You can work through Main Street programs or streetscapes. That's what's meant by beautification, and other factors which may bring community pride and values. And so, how you prioritize that's up to you. As long as you can reason that among yourselves and make the pitch to the funding agencies, then you're on your way to brownfields reuse. Next slide. So here's a quick graphic. It's probably more complicated than this, and there might be a circular process. But when you're going through a redevelopment process, these are the kinds of steps you will have to go through, and maybe repeat. And there's no one formula, and this is just one way people approach the process. Next slide. So how do you do this? Well, you have whoever's doing applying for a grant, whether it's a local government, nonprofit, a tribe, you have to have a team, and you need team with certain skills and education and experience. And if you don't, you can pay for them through these brownfields grants. You need to develop and implement your community vision. Again, these are your plans or your projects, and refine them, connect them to sites, and make your vision happen. Break down your project into components because there's a site assessment process, a cleanup process, a planning process, a community outreach process, a funding and a grants process, and everyone has a role there. And these may be paid consultants or people in the community or volunteers, or maybe your tab provider like CClear. Uh, we're there to help. You can estimate the costs and identify funding sources. Next slide. So I'm going to toss it back to Miriam, who can give you a sneak peek of what's coming next week. So Miriam?
Thank you so much, Ignacio. This was just, I think, a very brief touch on brownfields, why they happened and kind of what this intersection was with some of our federal regulations. When we get together again next week on the 11th, we're going to talk about how you all can work with regulatory agencies effectively and efficiently. We're going to walk you through our regulatory process. We're going to touch upon the process for investigations and cleanups and share some key terms that everyone who is working on brownfields should be familiar with. And we'll also get into some of these things that I touched upon, like land use covenants, community engagement. And then Ignacio will be part of that discussion again. We'll talk about reuse partnerships and collaboration. And in the end, we'll close all of that out because all of this revolves around funding. The fact that EPA, DTSC have significant funding. There are other agencies also that have funding, and we want to bring in as many communities as possible, as many projects as possible to utilize these fundings to clear up environmental uncertainties and take these sites, propel them forward into all the reuses and uses that Ignacio mentioned. And so there is a hyperlink here for you to register for that second part as well. Next slide, please. And so, as I mentioned in the beginning, we are here to really talk about some of these things that you can do so you can be aware of the funding that we have. The ECRG application cycle doesn't open until January, but we're out here really priming everyone to get their applications kind of pre-readied, get documents together, get their sites, and figure out what they need in order to build the best applications possible. Noemi's multi-use, multi-purpose assessment, RLF and cleanup grants are also open right now, and there's a November 22nd deadline, so submit as early as possible. They also have a lot of content, webinars, recording, and resources that you can use to build a good application. Next slide, please. Specific to the ECRGenius webinars for applicants, we do have specific updates from last time on regulatory oversight agreements. So we have a very focused presentation on that on October 20th. And then we also have, I believe the same day, the launch of our eligibility self-check tool. Last time we did like a pre-application that was very formal. This time we're launching a self-check tool. This self-check will actually get you a sense of whether you are, as an applicant, eligible, is your site eligible, and what are all the forms that you need to get together, the documents that you need to get together ahead of the actual application opening, so you can get ready for those things. And those are events that you can register at the hyperlink over here. And I think that's it. So we will turn this over to Sebastian, who is going to help moderate all your questions that we've been receiving through the chat. So Sebastian, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Yeah, and also I'm here, and thank you for all your questions. Let's see. Let's take this. Try to take this in order, and some may be more complicated or detailed than we can do now, or perhaps can be resolved on a follow-up call. But let's go to Catherine's Buchanan's question, and I think Miriam, you have a quick answer for this and some follow-up.
Sure. I do have a quick answer. The quick answer is that AB 304 is a new state regulation that both DTSC and the Water Board have to comply with. And it really is about having a structure working with local regulatory agencies. So with that, we have been working with one tribe in particular. We're learning a lot from our experience with them. And I think we've found a solution that works. So I would ask that Catherine, maybe if we could reach out to you to set some time up with you to talk to you specifically about what we can do and how we can bring in an ECRG application and make this process easier for you, because we do have some flexibility, and based on our experience with the other tribe we work with, I think maybe there's some avenues for this to work out. So with that, I'd say let's just set up some time to have another deeper conversation.
Thank you, Miriam.
And so Miriam,
I
I'll just add from an EPA standpoint, just addressing kind of the last comment that was made, that many tribes do not have access to experienced engineers in brownfields cleanups. So US EPA, on one of the slides that I went over, talked about as part of the Brownfields Act, there's about 50 million that's available for states and tribes through our response program. So if you are a federally recognized tribe, that's a non-competitive grant program to set up a larger response program. And in that, you can use funding from EPA to be able to hire these experienced engineers. So if you also have questions about that grant program, if your tribe is federally recognized and you're interested in learning more, you can also reach out to me directly.
Yes, and again, thanks for your question. This is really a 30,000-foot level overview we just brought, and some of your questions are really go to the nitty-gritty, and I think that's one of them. And so it may be worth following up with one of us on those questions, but I think that may have answered Robert Hawk's question as well. And so let's see, what was next? So Chris Spengler, are you recommending community gardens on contaminated sites? And I think you answered this. There was a string of responses regarding community gardens and on contaminated sites.
Sure, and I'll just go ahead and kind of re-emphasize what Sebastian said. There are a lot of different uses that can come out of a clean site. And oftentimes we've seen community gardens on a clean site as a transition to maybe a bigger use. That's the point that I was trying to make. So hopefully Sebastian's response cleared that up. So thank you.
All right. Okay. Here's another detailed question from Chris regarding timing of oversight. And I wouldn't say it's just DTSC, but let's see. Yes, I think it's more of the review process and the time it takes.
Yes, I see that question, and we've had a really good experience working with a lot of different affordable housing stakeholders. Like any program, our grant program has to have a deadline, and that deadline might not meet everyone's requirements. But we've had really good experience working with affordable housing developers, nonprofits in particular. If there's like specific questions or specific things that we can clear up, we're happy to set up a meeting with your clients and your stakeholders and have an open conversation with them about what we can do in terms of, within our structure, what we can do to provide flexibility to have them get more involved in brownfields and cleaning up these sites.
Yep, Ignacio, we skipped over a question from Suzanne Martin.
Go
who
ahead.
said we operate an urban farm on a decommissioned Navy base. Could Brownfields fund be used for improvement or expansion? It was a little bit before the Chris question on affordable
All right.
housing.
Yes. Okay.
And so
yeah.
it was just to respond to that from an EPA standpoint. So none of the funds from EPA can be used for the actual redevelopment. So if the improvement and expansion is of the urban farm, the redevelopment of that, then no, our funds could not be used. If you're asking in terms of improvement or enhancements, maybe there's areas of the Navy base that have not been cleaned up yet, and you would like to make the urban farm bigger, then there is a potential that Brownfields funds could be used to to do an assessment of the extent of contamination, and or two, potentially have that property cleaned up.
Thanks. No, I'm going to jump in as well. Our money is the same way. Our money can only be used for investigations, assessments, and cleanups, and we don't contribute to the reuse at all. I think there's also complications with the use of our money on federal sites. So this may not be a good fit for our equitable community revitalization grant program.
Yes, we will. The part two will. We can include some leveraging sources
Mhm.
in part two. And there was a question here about, oh gosh, other sources. Actually, for part two, we can also mention that free technical assistance that are available, because not all brownfields or uh, assistance you can get for assessment and cleanup are grants. You can get free technical assistance. It also depends on the state you are, the particular state you are in, because California is very different from Nevada and Arizona. So we can clarify that in part two. But generally, there is money from your state. There's money. There's free technical assistance also, depending on site eligibility and owner or uh, owner eligibility for assessment and cleanup, both from EPA and your state. So stay tuned for that next week. Um, let's see. And there's the question about costs were answered already for cost of phase ones and phase twos. I don't think I missed. Is there anything else I've missed here? And people, I think, can unmute themselves, right? If they want to ask any questions.
Yeah, but maybe raise your hand first, just so we
Okay.
can see how many. But
Raise your
Robert, I
hand.
see you have a question. Please go ahead.
Well, basically, my question was you restricted things to licensed engineers. My question was whether you allowed other licensed professionals to certify a site for your purposes, or does it have to be some type of licensed PE?
So this goes into AB 304 requirements, which are linked to the Business and Professions Code. And I believe it does not have to be just a PE. I believe it can a PG also fits for that requirement of a registered environmental professional.
So geologists or engineers would be okay. Anything else would be questionable or not allowed.
Yeah, and I should say that I'm not well versed on the Business and Professions Code. So definitely, if you want to send me an email, I can follow up with you and give you all of the correct information that'll get you to more specific answers.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
You're quite welcome.
I think we have 6 more minutes. So raise your hand if you have any questions, or if you have any suggestions on what you want covered in part 2, in addition to the detail of the MARC and ECRG funding. There are already webinars scheduled. The presentations, this presentation has hot links. So when you receive the PDF, you can click on those links and access those any recordings of recent webinars or webinars coming up this week. So Devin, can you let people know when the slides will be ready?
Yeah, we'll get those to you by the end of this week.
I think we put in some links to the webinars this week in the chat. There's one tomorrow actually, right? I forget who's having a webinar tomorrow, but there's going to be a webinar tomorrow.
EPA.
Yeah,
EPA.
EPA has the revolving loan fund webinar tomorrow.
And I did want to jump in. Devin just corrected in the chat. The eligibility self-check tool webinar is not on the same day as the regulatory oversight one. It's on I think the following week on October 27th. And so when we send the slides out, we'll have that information updated. Thank you so much for catching that, Devin. I was thinking it was going to be a very busy day with both of those webinars back to back.
And so EPA's cleanup tomorrow, EPA's webinar tomorrow is on cleanup grants, not on the revolving loan fund. So
Okay.
if you're interested in receiving or knowing more about the cleanup grants, I'll talk about it briefly at our second part. But tomorrow's webinar hosted by US EPA, I'll put that information in the chat. We'll be very in-depth into all of the guidelines that are associated with that on how to apply.
Any other hands showing? Well, I think we're good then. We'll give you 4 minutes of your day back, or maybe more. I don't know. Thank you for again attending. I hope this was useful to folks, especially the newbies. Again, we encourage you to dig in deeper because there's really a lot of potential funding and assistance that you have access to with a quick phone call or an email. We're all ready to help, regardless of where you are in your planning and or site site search. Let us know, because if you don't call us, we don't know what your issues are.
And I also wanted to jump in and say thank you to everyone. I know this was a lot of information packed up into a short amount of time. We have a lot of hyperlinks that are going to be part of the presentation that we share with you. So feel free to explore on your own time. But also just between now and next week, if you have any particular areas of emphasis that you'd like to learn more about, let us know. If we can incorporate it in next week's presentation, we are looking for content, and it may show up, in some other fashion in another one of our sessions, either by us or by EPA, or the content that we put out jointly. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.